When I think of Nikon vintage lenses, what I'm really thinking about are those lenses that kind of came out early 80s. They carried them for 15, 20, 25 years, a lot of them. But I'm talking about lenses that are manual focus and probably AIS lenses. So let me tell you what I know about vintage lenses in that mid telephoto range. And which one should you get? And I have my opinions. Now, the Toronto Blue Jays won the World Series in 92 and 93. Why is that important? Well, by 92 and 93, most pro photographers were using zoom lenses. We were using an 80 to 200, 2.8, or a 70 to 200 if you had a different brand or whatever. But we had switched to zoom lenses by then. And when I became a sports photographer, I was only autofocus. So I'm talking about lenses, vintage lenses that were the generation before that. Now, I worked at newspapers before I just shot sports, and those lenses were manual focus. And there were sort of biases that people had. Let me give you an example. The most popular lens for the pro was the Nikon 180. Again, you have to remember, there's no zoom lenses yet. They really haven't kind of come out for the pro at this point. So the 180mm lens, when I worked at a newspaper, that was the lens. Everybody loved the 180. Now, the 180 was heavy, it was big, but it was pretty fast for a 180. Now, it was a 2.8. If you had a camera with a split screen, half of the screen would go dark at around f3.5. So if your lens was a 3.5 or a 4, you couldn't use the split screen focus that most people were using. I mean, you could use it, it just had blacked out. So the 180-2.8 was a very desirable lens. Now, if you went to a parade, if you were out shooting, at a market, things like that, you could steal photos with the 180. It gave you enough distance from your subject that you could grab these candid photos, which were the bread and butter of the news photographer. We used the 180. Now, not everybody made a 180, but Nikon did, the 180-2.8. Now, it was updated to an ED version, and it was the first lens that people really bought that was an ED lens, so extra low dispersion glass. And I don't know if there was much of a jump in quality, but definitely the ED 180 was the desirable lens in the 80s. And out of my price range, I'm afraid to say. It was an expensive lens then. Now they're cheap. I mean, if you want a 180, you can get a nice ED version off eBay relatively cheap. Now, there were other options as well. The 180 definitely was the most popular. The most desirable is probably a better way to say it. Also in that sort of mid-telephoto range was the 200mm lens. Now, the 200mm lens was quite a bit lighter than the 180. So the 180 was like 800 grams, and the 200 was 500 grams. The 180 used a 72 filter. The 200 used a 52 filter, and it was very popular for those who couldn't afford the 180. It would have been, maybe a third of the price. And this, I'm talking like, 1981, and it was available till 96. So it was a popular lens for those who couldn't afford the 180, in my view. If you shot Nikon, people shot with the 180. But if you couldn't afford it, you used the 200. I had a 200. It was fine. It was sharp, but the split screen would black out on half the screen, so that was a bit of a disadvantage. Now, another lens that pros would use, again, not as many, but I definitely knew people who had it, was the 135 f2. Now, the f2, again, it's large. It was larger than the 180. It was a 72 filter, and it kind of came out in 1981 as an AIS lens. So it was out from 81 to 2005. A great lens. It had some modifications. Later versions of it became like a defocused lens where you could focus on your subject and defocus, out of focus the background, kind of control the background out of focusness, if that makes sense. But originally, it came out as a straight-up 135 f2. I knew people who had it. It was a great hockey lens. Big, heavy, fast, an f2 lens. Now, at the time, before we switched to zooms, I think the 180 was the most desirable of the mid telephotos. Now, because it was a 2.8. Now, Canon had a 200 2.8. Pentax had a 200 2.8. So they were probably more popular in those lines. But in Nikon, for some reason, they made this 180. Now, the lens that I would buy now, again, a vintage AIS manual focus lens, the lens that I would buy now is none of these lenses. Now, you could argue that the 180 is just as great as it ever was, and the 135 f2 is just as magnificent as it ever was. I understand it. You know what the problem with them is? They're too heavy. They're just too heavy. And I don't tend to steal photos. Like with the 180, the working distance gives you, you can be stealing photos without the person kind of knowing it. If you use a shorter lens, say this 135 2.8, you're a little bit closer to the subject. You can't really steal photos in the same way. But that's the lens that I like now. Now that we're not shooting pro sports with it, now that we're not shooting pro with it, I find the 135 a little better because I'm not going to a fire and trying to get a picture of the homeowner, on their lawn crying. Those days are behind me. So I'm not trying to steal photos. And the 135 is fantastic. I'll tell you why. First off, it's half the weight of the 180. It's 435 grams. It's way smaller. It uses a 52 filter. So that's fantastic. Now, the 135 from Nikon originally came out in 1959, and they made them all the way to 2020. But this 135 in the AIS, so this is like the last generation of manual focus. That was, they started in 81, and they went to like 2005. Now, the funny thing with Nikon back then was they only had one quality, their best quality. It was like now people don't realize it, but now there's price points. You can get a nifty 50. It's inexpensive. You can get this lens. It's, brands have multiple lenses in each focal length, multiple qualities. Depends where you want to jump in quality. But back in the vintage days, there was only top quality. They didn't make a price point lens. So if Nikon made a 200 f4, it was as sharp as they could make it. It had the mechanical quality of all the other lenses. It might have been less expensive, but it wasn't cheaper built. And the 135 2.8, again, it was less expensive, but it wasn't cheaper built. And they are magnificently built. These are like workhorse lenses. There's no real difference in the mechanical quality between the 135 2.8 and the 135 f2. In both situations, they were made to the highest standards that Nikon could make. Now, when did that all change? That all changed in 1981 when Nikon came out with a series of lenses called the E series. So they had their regular full quality lenses, the AIS. And then they came out with a price point series called the E series. Now, I'm not saying that they weren't good optically. I never actually used one optically. But they had some plastic in them possibly. They were lighter. They were smaller. They were way less expensive. And this was the first time that a major brand came up with a lineup of lenses, the E series economy. They came up with a lineup of lenses that were price points based. So we're trying to keep the price of this lens in a certain sphere. Before that, they made the best quality they could, and their lens cost what it did. The 135 E series kind of changed all that. Was there anything wrong with them? No, but they were just an economy lens. That was, when it changed, 1981. Previous to that, Nikon lenses were all the same mechanical quality no matter which one you bought. And they had made them optically as good as they could. Now, if they were using ED glass, those were better optically, but mechanically the same. So when did Nikon move away from these vintage high-quality lenses? Well, the Nikon F4 came out in 1988, and that was their first autofocus camera. a professional autofocus camera. So the lenses started to migrate into autofocus around that time. The 180 was available as an AIS manual focus, and then it was switched over to autofocus pretty quickly. And I remember photographers buying the autofocus version and not taking it from the store and saying they want the mechanical version, the manual version instead. But when the F5 came out with an autofocus zoom lens, you were really onto something. Now, I also had a Nikon F6. They came out in like 2004. They were magnificent. However, the ship had sailed. We were all totally, the pros shooting pro sports had totally switched to digital by the time the F6 came out. So I bought one because I wanted one, but I never really used it professionally. It wasn't digital. It was great, but it wasn't digital. Anyways, so that's kind of a roundup of these mid-telephoto lenses. There was a couple of others, like there was, as I said, that 135E lens, and Nikon also made a 135 3.5. Nothing wrong with that, except you're going to be buying these used. You might as well buy the 2.8. It's that little bit faster, which means that the split screen's not going to black out. And it was virtually the same weight. So you might as well get the 2.8 version. Because we're buying these used, decades old, you don't pay that much for them. So I would get the 135 2.8. Would I buy the 135 f2? Would I buy the 180? I wouldn't, because they're too heavy and they're too big. So I would buy the 135 2.8. That's one of my favorite lenses. Now, if you're shooting with the 135 and you're doing portraits, if you're doing sort of like a waist up, waist and head kind of shot, you'd be about 16 feet away from your subject. And if you're doing more of a head shot, you'd be 7 or 8 feet away. At 16 feet, you could do a great portrait. You'll drop the background out. You'll have a narrow angle of view. You don't really want to be too much further away from your subject, though, because it'd be a little bit far for them to take direction, and there'd be people maybe walking in between you and the subject. So that's what I like about the 135, is that kind of working distance. The 180 now, if you're doing portraits, it's a little bit long. You're a little bit far away. The 200 f4, you're a little bit far away for portraits. Yeah, you can do it. But the distance, if you're doing like a waist up shot with the 200, the distance is pretty big. Like, yes, the background would be narrow. Yes, you could really isolate the subject from the background. All that's fantastic. But it's kind of like a long working distance, I would say. So what I bought, what I'm happy with, is the 135 2.8. Now, the other thing to consider is how many lenses you want to own and how many lenses you want to carry. So it's good to figure out the mid-telephoto length that you like before you buy everything else. Because if you buy a 135, maybe you don't buy a 105. It's too close. If you buy a 135, maybe you buy an 85. Maybe you just go right with a 50. But if you bought a 180 or a 200, you might want to get a 105. So sort of set the parameters of what you want to do. Is it going to be a 135, a 180, or a 200 in that mid-telephoto range? And that kind of dictates what you do beyond that. What other lenses you kind of put in the bag. Anyways, that's my view on these vintage lenses. Amazing quality, great sharpness, fantastic. Now, these images were shot with the 135 2.8 at about f8. So I'm stopped down. I'm right in that real great sharpness zone with the lens. Nice working distance. It's easy to handhold. Very comfortable on the camera. And, these shots, again, nice and sharp. I've just had to burn the corners in. So as you can see here, I've done a straight print and then I burned it in. And this next one, I did a straight print and then I burned it in. And I did another print. I burned it in a little bit more. This shot just shows the burn, just the burn area. And then this final shot is kind of what I like as a photograph. So straight print, a little bit of burning in on the corners. But this 135 2.8, it's a great lens, great vintage lens. I highly recommend it. I really like it.